so hopefully you can see this, but my name is Ben. My pronouns are he and him, and I am one of the assistant directors of admission at Fairfield University in Connecticut. If you've heard of Regis in the Denver area, it's somewhat similar to that. But over the years, I've worked at a few different places post-grad, and everywhere from small private selective liberal arts colleges to large land-grant institutions. And now I'm back here. So excited to be here with you both today.
Hi, my name is Shana Thomas. I use she, hers pronouns, and I work at Trinity College, which is in Hartford, Connecticut. So I actually don't know how far that is from Fairfield. So I'm not going to say anything about that, but we're in the same state.
My name's John Haskell. I am a tutor who specializes in test preparation, and I see it as my job to help people not only prepare for the test, but basically navigate the whole testing process. I live in Crested Butte, Colorado, spent many years in the Roaring Fork Valley. But so I'm hoping I can answer some questions and make it a little bit easier to wrap your head around that process of what tests you need to take and when you should think about taking them. So.
Perfect. And so I don't know if y'all want to throw in the chat kind of what year you are, if you're parents, if you're students, just so we can learn a little bit more about you maybe. That way, as we kind of move forward, we make sure that we're, answering your questions as we go along. But while you're doing that, we'll kind of get cruising. So what are we going to cover today, right? So a few different areas, I think testing can be stressful for a lot of us. I know it was for me when I was applying to colleges and universities. And so we want to make sure that we really talk about some testing policies and terms in regard to testing at different institutions, and really what does it all mean. Kind of move on to what the difference is between the SAT and the ACT. Are they more similar? Are they more different? The breakdowns of both, and kind of which one you may take, things like that. Whether to submit test scores or not to, because that's often stressful for those test optional institutions out there. And then we'll kind of dive into questions. But again, we really want to make sure we're catering this to kind of your interest, your questions, where you are in the process. So kind of keep us updated if you can as to, where you're at in the process. But can I get rolling? Anyone want to start us off? Shayna?
Yeah. Okay. So test optional. A test optional institution would be just like a school where you have the option of whether or not you submit your test scores. And, there's a number of factors that go into that decision that we'll talk about a little bit later, but that's what that means. Test blind means that they do not look at your test scores at all, regardless of whether you submit them. So there's, no knowledge there. Test flexible, Ben?
Sure. So at test flexible institutions, so again, like there are obviously institutions out there that still require that you submit your scores. But there are a few other things that, I think are somewhat not confusing, but we, think each school does it the same way, but we all kind of do it a little bit differently. So it's really important to talk to your counselors. But when it comes to text flexible institutions, there are only a few, and those are the ones that allow you, if you don't want to submit the SAT or ACT, you can actually submit other testing sources like international baccalaureate exams or AP exam test scores in place of those things. But again, there's lots of different kinds of these things, and every institution is a little bit different. But one of the biggest things that can be offered are things like super scoring at institutions, which maybe, John, you can kind of dive into.
So super scoring, that is when a school combines different scores from different test dates. So the SAT consists of an 800 score, it's out of 800 for math, and a score, it's out of 800 for verbal. If a school super scores the SAT, they'll take your best math from this test date, your best verbal from that test date, and they'll combine them to give you a score out of 1600 that might be higher than what you've gotten on any one test. The ACT super scoring, well, it actually super scores 4 sections. There's an English, math, reading, science. So in that sense, it's a little bit more advantageous on the ACT because you're super scoring 4 separate things. And actually worth mentioning is that the ACT, they're always really making an effort to make things user-friendly or peer user-friendly. They recently came out with a thing where they will actually super score for you instead of having to submit all of your test dates that you want to use for a super score. They will actually combine it and allow you to submit that to institutions that accept super score. It seems to be right around half to just over half of schools that seem to super score. A few more super score the SAT than the ACT, kind of just because that's how it's always been.
Yeah, and there are obviously some schools out there that prohibit score choice, which we'll kind of get into a little bit later. John will probably talk a little bit about, how many times to take the test and things like that. But just so you are aware, there are some schools out there that won't super score your testing, which is somewhat interesting, and that will take all of your tests into account depending on how many times you take it. So it's important to note that as well. But Shayna, there's some other opportunities to think about in testing.
So you can self-report your scores, or you can send in your official scores, and for each school it'll be a difference in like what they'll allow. But say for a self-reported score, then you could send that yourself through say email, and it's free because you did it yourself. But for an official score, it does cost money to send those to different institutions, so it can be a little more cost effective sometimes to self-report your own scores rather than send the official one, and if the school allows it. But that is a conversation that you would need to have with like not with each counselor, but you have to look into it at each individual college. And then I'll let John take fee waivers.
And one thing, first, before I talk about the fee waivers, just to expand upon what you said there, I don't know if this is at all schools, but I know that at certain schools, if you self-report scores, they will then require you to submit your official scores upon admission to the institution. So, they're still, it's not going to result in people fudging their scores or anything. You still obviously are going to be honest with that, but it just saves you having to spend the money to submit scores for a school that you don't even end up getting into. Fee waivers. There's actually two types of fee waivers. If you are on national free and reduced lunch, you would qualify for fee waivers both for the submission of scores and for the registration cost of the SAT or the ACT. I believe both the SAT and the ACT let you take it twice for free if that applies to you. So definitely something to look into. Anything to add about that?
Yeah, that's kind of I think the general overview. I think that's perfect for fee waivers. I think you should really reach out to your counselor if you are concerned about the cost, your guidance or college counselor, if you're concerned about the cost of taking these tests or sending them. I think that one really important thing to note is that, we all work in our respective fields, right? Some college admission and then kind of tutoring, test prep type things. And we all kind of know a decent amount about our areas. But everything kind of falls, every school is a little bit different. So I really encourage you at the end of this presentation, if you take anything away, it's that you make sure to ask questions to all of us, ask questions to the different counselors at different institutions, because everywhere does things a little bit differently. What I'll add to the note about the self-reported and official scores is, John's right. So like, it's usually upon enrollment. So if, not so much admission always, but if you choose to enroll at a school and they accept your self-reported scores, most times, not all, they will ask for the official scores at the end of the day. But then you are only spending the money if you choose to enroll. And that's something like Fairfield does. It's what a number of other schools tend to do as well. But again, every school is a little bit different. So you should always really ask those questions. Let's see what we got next here. John, I think I'm going to throw this one to you because you are the testing guy.
No, I'd be happy to talk about this because this is one of the big things that I help people think through. I get phone calls from parents. Well, wait, do I need to take both of them? Do all schools take the ACT? I mean, the short answer is that you do not need to take both of them. Any school in the country will gladly accept either one. Actually, I found an exception to that recently. One of my students came across some. It might have even been a for-profit institution that only accepted the ACT, but really any school you want to go to is going to accept either one. They want to see whichever one is going to show you in the better light. As far as how different are they, they're not all that different. It's Pepsi versus Coke. But I think the biggest difference, well, you've got a chart of it, so we'll get to that a little bit later. I do think that people should take one of them, not the other, figure out which one you're likely to do better on. And I'll talk a little bit right now about how to do that. I think that, well, basically you're going to want to take a practice test of either one, compare the scores, see how those break down. Some people would do significantly better on one than the other. Short version of the differences between them. The ACT includes a science section, which the SAT does not. Doesn't really have to do with science, though. It's really just a graph reading section. The SAT is a little bit tougher reading than the ACT. The reading level is a little bit higher, but the ACT is much more tightly timed. So for most people who can finish the ACT with no problem, might be a better test. If you have timing issues on the ACT, the SAT is probably the better test.
Yeah, and one thing I always like to mention is those diagnostic tests, those practice tests that John mentioned, you can get them for free on the website. Like that doesn't require a cost necessarily. Just to take a look around. It's kind of like shopping. You're going to taste test, right? Figure out which one works best for you. There are all these different factors, right? And so I think that, whether you're, a first year student in high school, whether you've taken it once, whatever it might be, just think about what your strengths are, try to make sure you understand where you're getting into. Go ahead, John.
Just a little bit later on in this presentation, I'm going to pull up some resources that are either free or not all that expensive, that would be the right ones to use, because it really is important if you're doing a diagnostic or just preparing for this test that you're using the right stuff. There's a lot of practice tests out there made by third-party test prep companies that are not real SATs or ACTs. They're basically made up by a guy like me to replicate an SAT, and they often really miss the mark. So it is important that you use authentic materials, and I'll point you in the right direction of those later on.
So as John kind of mentioned, I'm just going to pull up kind of a breakdown of what both the SAT and the ACT look like. Trini, you want to just quickly kind of read through this sucker?
Yeah, so what you're looking at here is we broke down like the sections that each test has, how many questions is in each one, the time that you get for each section, and then how it's scored. So for the SAT, which is out of 1,600, you have a reading section, which is 52 questions that you have 65 minutes to complete. And the score will be between like 200 and 800. And then you have a writing comprehension section with 44 questions that you'll get 35 minutes to complete. And again, out of 200 to 800. And then they combine the reading and writing comprehension sections. So you'll get like 2 out of 800 scores. And the other one would be for the math section. And that is 58 questions. So for 20 of them, you have to do it without a calculator. And for 38, you can do it with a calculator. And then you would get 80 minutes for that, 25 minutes for the non-calculator questions, and 55 minutes for the calculator questions. The SAT used to have optional essays and also subjects that you could take, but those are now no longer an option. So one less thing for y'all to worry about.
Yeah. So, this is kind of what this breaks down into. And again, the College Board dropping those optional essay and subject tests is this year type of thing. It just kind of came out. So it's pretty new, which is kind of interesting. It used to be that some schools required you submitted the optional essay. That's kind of dissipated over the years. And for a number of different reasons, the College Board has chosen to kind of drop these things. But we've also got the ACT, and maybe John, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so very similar to the SAT, the English corresponds to the writing language section on the SAT. They're darn near identical. The ACT did it that way first. The SAT used to test you on the same content in a different way, but I guess they figured the ACT was doing it better, because when they did the revision, they made it look a lot like the ACTs. Math, one notable difference is that you have your calculator on the entire ACT math section. That said, it's quicker paced, and it does cover a little bit more content than the SAT math. The reading, fairly similar. Reading comprehension section, left to right, top to bottom. You read the passage, answer the questions. And then the science, as I mentioned, is the one kind of weird section on the ACT. It's kind of polarizing. Some people think it's the easiest thing they've ever seen. Some very smart people think it's the hardest thing they've ever seen. It's really a test of your ability to quickly extract information from graphs. You kind of got to take a look at one to get a sense of what it's about. But as you see here, the time per question, if you're sitting there doing the math, it's a lot less than it is on the SAT. And it feels like it on the ACT. It feels like you've got to move a lot quicker. So time management is really the name of the game on the ACT. There is an optional essay. It's not as important as it used to be now that the SAT has dropped theirs. There used to be a good number of institutions that required either the SAT or the ACT to be with the essay. I'm not going to say none, but I don't think very many schools are requiring the essay on the ACT anymore, because its counterpart on the SAT doesn't exist.
And John, I know you wanted to kind of share a little bit, some resources and things like that. Is that something you'd like to kind of throw up on
Yeah,
that?
could you unshare yours and I'll just pull that up on, I've just got some websites up here. Let me get those.
Perfect. But yeah.
So first of all, oh, go ahead. Were you gonna say something, Ben?
Nope. Go for it.
Okay. So first of all, some resources for preparation. Actually I shared the wrong tab here. So let me share this one instead. So what you want to use for prepping for the ACT, it's this book. ACT is not quite as nice as the SAT because they don't give their good stuff for free, but it's also not all that expensive. This book has, what do they have this year? I believe it has 5 tests in it. That's going to be the one you're going to want to use, as opposed to say a Princeton or Kaplan or McGraw-Hill book, because those have replica tests. The ACT does not license their tests. They sell it themselves in their own book. So this has real tests. Now the equivalent on the SAT is this right here, the blue book. That's what you're going to want to use for the SAT. And those same tests, this has 8 real tests. Those same tests are available actually through 2 sources online. One, if you just Google, official SAT practice tests, you pull up a site on the College Board's domain let me pull that up once more. I think I pulled that into a different tab. So that is right here on the College Board's domain. They give you access to all of their practice tests, tests 1 through 10. You can download those, print those. I do recommend that if you're going to take more than like 2 or 3 of them, get the book. It's going to be cheaper than the paper and ink you spend printing these out. And I do recommend that you print them. Don't try to take a test, with the computer screen. It's just not how it's going to be on test day. And so you want to simulate a test day environment when you take a practice test. Now, if you're interested in doing this as a diagnostic, take one of the ACT tests out of the ACT book I showed you, take an SAT test out of this SAT book or print it online, and you're going to compare your scores. Now, how do you do that? You Google SAT, ACT concordance. Let's just do that right now. And this is actually really neat because the SAT and the ACT went in on this together. So they've both signed off on this. And so you can consider it a pretty accurate comparison between the two. So let's say that you got a 1200 on your first attempt at the SAT, but you got a 23 on your first attempt at the ACT. Borderline, but that's getting to be a big enough difference that I would say you probably want to go with the SAT unless you had a huge subjective preference for the ACT. Anything more than 2 points on the ACT scale, I would say absolutely 100%. Let the numbers do the talking. Most people will do pretty similarly on them, within a point or 2 of the ACT. And at that point, I would say just really, you can base the decision on subjective considerations. But some people will do like 4 or 5 points better on an ACT scale on one test compared to the other. And so that's why I do think if you're going to put any significant time into test prep, whether that's like on your own through an online platform with a tutor like me, I do think that it makes sense to do some diagnostic work to make sure you're putting your time into studying for the right one. The one other resource I wanted to show you up here, Khan Academy. Khan Academy has a relationship with the College Board. So the material they use here is official. It's signed off on by the College Board, and it's a great online prep platform. I would highly recommend that if you're going to prep for yourself online, use this. And the funny thing is it's free, but I think it's straight up a better test prep platform than a lot of the third-party ones that you could pay hundreds of dollars for. So I do recommend checking it out. I think that was all I wanted to show you right there. Do you want to pull up the presentation again, Ben?
Absolutely. I just want to make sure, talking about accommodations first. I know you.
Absolutely. I think that's an important point to discuss because both the SAT and the ACT offer accommodations to people with certain disabilities. Now, people hear accommodations, they mean, typically extra time. It's not limited to extra time, but that is a common one that they give. Who does that apply to? If you have a diagnosed learning disability that you receive accommodations for in school, basically, assuming you go to a public school, if you're on an IEP or 504 plan, you would likely qualify. If you're not on one of those, even if you have something, it's unlikely, but not impossible that you would qualify. But the biggest criteria they look at is whether you receive accommodations in school. There are some other conditions that they do give certain accommodations for, certain psychiatric conditions that you're either taking medications or having to see somebody for, or certain medical conditions even. And it might not be extra time, but they might give you the ability to say stop the clock or take the different sections in different days. Things like diabetes, epilepsy, certain autoimmune disorders, Crohn's disease, anything that would, in a medical sense, interfere with your ability to take the test like other people can. So if that's something that applies to you, you probably want to talk to your counselor, to your high school counselor, about how they can get the ball rolling on getting you applied for accommodations. It is a separate process for both the SAT and the ACT. Oh, and one other thing that I did neglect to mention here, if you attend public school in Colorado, you are mandated to take the SAT, so that if you didn't want to go through the whole rigmarole of a diagnostic, you could just, if you're going to just default to one, I would say default to the SAT, because you've got to take that anyway. I believe it's April 13th, I think it is. It will be offered at your high school. And so you kind of get one freebie anyway for the SAT, and that's a totally valid test, even though it's not a national test. You can use that for admission to any school.
Perfect. Now, kind of that big question, we talked about, how, there are going to be some institutions that, require you to submit your tests, but then there are an overwhelming number, especially in the time of COVID, that are test optional in different ways. And so I feel as though one thing that I get asked most often is, do I submit my scores or not? Which is super understandable. That was something I was stressed about. And Shayna and I both work at test optional institutions, so I'm actually going to let her have a crack at this first, and then we'll kind of both chat after.
Okay, yeah. So again, every college is different, but at Trinity, we're like really, really test optional. Like, it does not have any negative implications on an application if a student doesn't submit their scores. So we've always really encouraged students to only submit their scores if they're a good representation of you as a student and an academic, and the person that you are in the classroom. If you feel like they show evidence of high achieving, then you should definitely submit them. But if your scores do not represent who you are as a student, or they're not the most complimentary and they might hurt your application, then we encourage students to be really cognizant about that and make the choice not to. Most schools, you can find their median range on their website. If not, you can just ask the school. And definitely don't want to submit a score that is below a test optional school's median range. Ideally, you want a score that's representative of the rest of your grades, or at least in the higher end, middle end of that median range, but definitely nothing below it. But always make it accurate to who you are as a student and a performer, because at a lot of schools, it really will not hurt your application if you choose to opt out of submitting your test scores. I didn't submit my test scores when I applied to college. About 80% of our current first year class at Trinity didn't submit their test scores when they applied, and 60% of our current sophomore class. So it's just one piece of many pieces of your application. And it is one piece that can definitely hurt.
And I think, it's important to note that, there's definitely a stigma out there where everyone feels that they, we might be pulling the wool over your eyes, blowing some smoke, trying to tell you at a test option institution, oh, we still kind of want you to submit. That is not the case. If we say we're test optional, and you can ask every counselor, that's what we are here for. You can ask us, how do you look at test scores? If they say they are test optional, they mean it. Every school can do it slightly differently. There are definitely some schools out there that say they're test optional, but they require them for merit scholarship. Majority don't do that, but there are some that do. But think about it this way, it hasn't gotten easier to get into college over the years. It's definitely gotten more difficult in some ways. But just because the school is test optional doesn't mean it's less selective or less rigorous. We're just looking to see what you feel is the best representation of your ability. We know that these tests are not fully encompassing. We don't use them in a vacuum, right? We're not just like, oh, this score means this and that's all it is. It's not just a simple numbers game at a test optional institution. We're using it as contextual evidence. All right. So as Shana was kind of mentioning, we want to see what best represents you. Okay. Um, some schools will have different medium ranges. You may be, the best student in your class with a solid score, but it may not still be representative of your academic ability. Think about it in a way that if you're going to perform somewhere, right? You're not going to wear, your t-shirt and shorts. You're going to wear something nice, right? You're going to show us what your best representation is. And so as you kind of approach these things, I want you to think about it like that. Again, counselors are literally here to help you. We are an extension of your college or guidance counselors. We want to make sure that you find your right fit institution. People are often really concerned about getting to the best school, but think about it being the best school for you. All right. And so we want to see what you can do, who you are as a student. And we use these as, again, contextual evidence as a supporting aspect to your high school transcript or GPA. It is generally more holistic than it is just a cut and dry yes or no. And John, did you want to add anything to this part?
No, I think that's a really good description of the process. It does, here's a question that I'm interested in that I think will just give us more light on the issue, a difficult question for you. But, I think that when schools were leaning more heavily on tests, it gave them, one of the advantages. I don't think that even 10 years ago, before the whole test optional movement, I don't think most people in your shoes would have said that the SAT or ACT is a great metric, but they would have said, but it's a quick metric. And
Sure.
that was probably where its advantage was. It would seem that it makes your job as an admissions officer significantly harder, having to sift through applications when there's not a quick number to look at. What factors have taken on more importance in the applications?
Sure. So I think every school is a little bit different, but a lot of it does weigh on your transcript, right? And every school does things differently, right? Their GPAs are on 4-point scales, they're on 5-point, they're on 8-point scales. Some schools don't even have letter or number grades. They literally have narratives about how they did in class, which sounds unbelievable, but it's true. And so I know, they're a lot of them, Florida, the Northeast, they'll get you. But what I'll say is that even back then, when things were a little bit more heavily weighed on those test scores, your high school transcript was still the best representation of your possible ability in college. Yes, it's nice to have, in some cases, it can be nice to have another data point if we want to be very data-esque about it. And it can make it easier. And that's why some schools still require it, right? And they'll tell you that. But what I will say is that we know that the tests have their own issues. Some students have a lot of extra, help in prepping for them. We have students who don't have any prep, that can afford certain things, that can't afford certain things. And we know that, students are going to score differently in different parts of the country, different areas. It's not again, kind of like we were talking about, not in a vacuum. There are contextual aspects to the prep, to the students' school they go to, and everything that make a difference. And there are things that the College Board, specifically at least, is trying to introduce to give us more contextual evidence to the reason a score might be stronger or less strong, or whatever it might be, and how they might be really strong for that student's school or that area. And that's important evidence. And as I would say the next 5 to 10 years is my guess, as the ACT and the College Board think more deeply about how these scores are used, I think the more data points, the better. But I think at this time, things are somewhat in limbo, in my opinion, as to how much data is used when it comes to making admission decisions. I would say a lot of it weighs on those academics. I think some schools that measure demonstrated interest, I don't want to dive in too deep here, but schools that look at how likely it is that you will come if you're offered admission, Those things matter, but overall, I'd say things like a recommendation really matter. Things like, yes, your transcript, I think are the most important things at the end of the day. I don't think that these days testing is as looked at as a completely straightforward and simple numbers game as they used to be. That was a really long-winded answer. So, oh, go ahead, Shayna, please.
I don't think it makes the job any harder necessarily. Just again, like Ben mentioned earlier, like a lot of schools, not every school, but like we do tend to look at applications holistically, and like test scores are just one piece of information. And even in themselves, like you don't just, it's not just a number, at least like Trinity specifically, like if the number is, we put that in line with what kind of school you go to, like what your background might be, like what resources again that you had access to. And it's never like just, it's not that cut and dry. So I think that it doesn't add that layer of complication because we're looking at like the activities you do and like your classes and like all these different pieces of the puzzle. So the test score, which, you know, it's a test that you take maybe what 1, 2, 3 times. It's not as reflective as things that you've put like years or months of your life into. But yeah.
And what I will say is, you know, it can't, all right, the extra data point can be helpful in contextualizing things, but what I will say is that it might take us a little bit more time if we don't have a test score. But what I will say is that it's in our best interest to give your application the time because we're looking for the best students. We're looking to see who is going to be the best fit for our institution. And so regardless of, you know, if it takes, you know, contextually a little bit longer, if we don't have an extra data point, we are still looking for the strongest students, right? Who are super involved and all those other things in your application. But from an academic standpoint, we want great students. And we know that the test isn't the perfect representation of who you are in the classroom. For some students it is, many it isn't. But understand that we want strong students, we want great students. And so we're not looking for ways to make it more difficult, I guess. We're looking for reasons to admit you, not to find reasons to deny you from an institution. It's kind of my last little bit there. Now, I know we kind of talked quite a bit. I know we've got a couple of you on the line. And so we're wondering if any of you have any questions for us. What do we got out there? Anybody? Oh, you know everything. That was so encompassing. You now know everything about testing, everything about college. And it doesn't have to be testing specific. You can ask other questions too. Fair enough.
I have a question going back to the super scoring. And if you do come across a school that does do super scoring and you decide that you, and potentially even it's test optional, how many times do you attempt to take a test to get a really diverse score range? What would be the recommendation? Do you take it more than just your school offers it? Do you go out and take it a couple times privately once you found SAT versus ACT that might be a better test for you if you do think that you want to submit scores?
Well, I think that that the answer is it depends. I think that at least twice. I think that everybody who thinks that they might want to use test scores in admission should take the test at least twice, because you know what, we're human beings and we're not always going to be at our very best. And specifically, I see a lot. I'll see somebody take the test once and then their score jumps, 100 points on the SAT their very next time taking it. And I can't explain that by the small amount of prep they've done with me between those. It's more, they've kind of bridged the gap between what their true ability was and what they showed they were capable of on their first time, because they probably were a little bit more comfortable taking it their second time. There are, I think 3 is a nice amount of times for a lot of people to take it. And there are some situations where it makes sense for a student to take it more than that. Specifically, if they don't feel like they've done their best work. I work with students over the course of months, and if I have a student who is getting 1500s consistently on practice tests, and they've taken the real test 3 times, and their best score is a 1400, 9 times out of 10, that student is going to want to take the test again. And there's a good chance that if they do that, that they'll be able to eventually bridge that gap, get the type of score they know that represents their true ability and that they would feel proud to submit to a college.
Another thing that I'll mention is, students take these tests at different times throughout their high school experience. And you're obviously in school right now, right? These students are in school, and you learn more and more every year. And so whether it's about content, whether it's about literally cognitive development, you may find things jump even with minimal test prep, right? So I think, to John's point, like, it's worth taking at least twice. I think 2 times is pretty solid. 3 times seems pretty good. But, you might take it first or second semester of your junior year, and then you might take one going into your senior year and find you do a lot better, right? Because you have a little bit more under your belt. And so when I think about that, that's not the case for everybody. But that should be kind of kept in mind as well.
You have a question in the chat.
Oh, yeah, sorry. That was my question, but
Go ahead, Haver.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Haver. I was just curious. I've been able to look it up before, but in your opinion, what is the best way to contact the college officers to get more information about their test policy?
Well, at Trinity, at least, usually you can just call, send an email. We get back pretty fast. We have a general admissions office email, and they sometimes answer, but other times, like, the counselors themselves are answering, and all of our email addresses and contact information are just up on our website, and it can tell you like who would be your counselors. I mean, if you go to school in Colorado, it is me, so you can just email me. My email's in this PowerPoint somewhere, and we can talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we all have pretty, comprehensive websites where, whether it's about just looking through, or if you go to our admission site, and there's often like a find your counselor section. And whether it's through that website or just the email being listed, you can type in your specific high school and it'll tell you who's your counselor. And so that's kind of the best way to do it. And again, like, I appreciate that question a lot, because I think fewer students utilize admission officers than y'all might believe. We are here to make it easier. We're trying to give you because at the end of the day, one of the biggest things I always say is, our jobs are trying to get you to apply to our institutions. And if you're admitted, we try to get you to come. But we will feel good about ourselves if we know that you are informed as to what we have to offer, how our processes work, because we know that things can differ. So please use those tools, reach out to us over email. We're happy to respond. It's literally our job. We're counseling you on our specific admission process. So use that tool, however it might be found on each website. But I encourage you, whether you've applied, not applied, it can be a year before you've applied. It's fine with me. Reach out and just check in and say, hey, listen, like, what's good here? And that doesn't mean ask, how's your psych program? But if you have a testing question or something, I know you said y'all are test optional, what does that mean for your school? I think that's totally a worthwhile question. And you can find our emails online, and we're more than happy to chat with you. Oftentimes, you can do the same thing over the phone. We'll chat with you too. And if you dare, Zoom. Yeah. I know, horrible place these days. Anybody else out there?
I was also curious, you were talking earlier about how Colorado's an SAT state. Are you able to take the ACT as well and submit an ACT?
Yeah, absolutely. All that means Colorado is an SAT state is that the SAT is part of Colorado's state assessment, which means that it's given to every public school junior in April. The same date that the younger kids are doing other testing. It doesn't mean that you can't take the ACT. It means that you just need to sign up to take it on your own through a national administration of the test. And there are plenty of those offered in Colorado. I would think that there are probably just about as many administrations of the ACT offered in Colorado as there are of the SAT. Haver, where do you live in Colorado, if you don't mind my asking?
I live in Aspen.
Okay, cool. So you definitely want to look at when you go online to the SAT or the ACT's website. They both have test center locators, and you can find which test dates are administered in the Roaring Fork Valley. I know that CRMS in Carbondale, they're the ones who host most tests in the Valley. They do host most SATs and most ACTs, but that's not all of them. And so the main reason I was asking you that question is that, depending on where you lived, you might be pretty far from where you're going to find a test center. And so some people really need to kind of either be prepared to drive or be just planning ahead which dates they're going to take it based on the geographic availability. I should also say that even though Colorado is an SAT state, the schools in Colorado recently, and I'm not going to go on limb and say it's all of them, but the schools, the ones that I know of, the public institutions in Colorado, I believe are all test optional at this point. And there was actually a piece of legislation involved. The only reason I'm not going out on the limb and saying definitively all of them is the wording of the legislation was a little bit odd. It was saying that schools don't have to require test scores. Does that mean that they cannot? It seems that none of them are, but there might be some school that I'm missing. But the big ones, CU is definitely not. Here in this valley, Colorado Western is not requiring test scores. So.
I have one other question, and this is kind of the future of testing, and what you guys think that may look like. I mean, it sounds, Ben, that you think the College Board and some of these SAT and ACT institutions are going to be kind of changing their tests to be more reflective of potentially the student or the student's abilities in the coming years. I mean, do you see testing going away or just changing?
Sure, I think it's all hearsay at this point. I think the test will always be adjusted over the years. The biggest thing I think may be changing is the amount of data that institutions have in regard to contextual evidence for scores. That's kind of the biggest thing that's coming out right now. Different institutions are piloting something called Landscape, which is through the College Board, that kind of gives you just massive amounts of data about each student as to, whether it's about income or other things in certain areas, as to, the student may have this test score, but here are the other factors that you should be considering, because it's not a cut and dry simple thing. And so what I think is schools will start to have more data. It'll allow them to be a little bit more granular. However, I don't think that, in the near future at least, they will become things that are just so definitive that they are the perfect predictors of success in college. But that's what I would say is my 2 cents there. And that's just my opinion.
An interesting thing that I came across, and I actually didn't come across this until about 11 p.m. last night when I was kind of researching what I was going to talk about. But it was widely publicized when the UC schools, University of California, they went test blind, not just test optional. They won't even look at them. And so I was thinking, that's California. They're all, surf's up, dude. They don't want to look at some test scores. Well, it turns out that they do. They're in the process of developing their own test. So I thought that was really interesting. I thought that them going test blind was saying, we don't want to see this. Testing doesn't represent who you are. This is nonsense. But it seems like their issue is that they just want to have a better test. And so I'll be really curious what they come out with. And I know that they intend to make it available to students outside of California for the main purpose of applying to UC schools. But, I wonder if they do make a better test, will that gain favor among other schools? Will other schools be paying them money to use their test? I wonder. So it'll just be interesting to see how that plays out.
I think that's thoughtful because I listened to a few people speak about testing. And one of the biggest things that comes out is people saying, is testing going to be obsolete, and will it ever go away? And the answer is probably not, kind of like John is saying, because even if one is taken away, right? Say that happens, something will have to replace it somehow. And we can kind of see that happening, like John's mentioning. I think it says a lot about the future of the value, the way, universities value these tests and different versions of them.
Well, I think we're right at the end of our session here. So on behalf of Western Slope College Fair, I want to thank our panelists today, John, Sheena, and Ben, for this very informative information. They have provided their email, so you can contact them if you have any further questions. And if the students just want to make sure that they throw their name and school and grade in the chat, then there'll be that for the panelists as well to have a record of. And we're just really grateful that you took this time on your Sunday to come and talk to us all and give us this very valuable information. So thank you all so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
Right.
Our pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Speaking to
Anna,
you
thank you
guys.
very much.
Yep. Great. Nice to meet you all.
All right. See y'all later.
All
Thanks
right,
again.
round two.
Bye-bye.
That's right.